Hello and welcome to the Corporate Facility Council webinar, Managing Risk and Delivering Facility Services. Everyone has been muted for audio quality, and this webinar is being recorded. A recording will be posted to the CFC website within the next 24 hours. And if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, you may download one now on your control panel. Go to the handout section, expand that out, and you can download that now. Next slide, please. I am happy to introduce our speaker today. It is IFMA board member Lori Gilmer. She is President COO of Facility Engineering Associates, and she's also on the global board for IFMA, a qualified instructor. And she also holds all of our credentials, the FMP, SFP, and CFM. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lori. Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Today we're on our September webinar series in the first Wednesday's set, and today we're going to be talking about managing risk and delivering facilities. We spent a lot of time thinking about day-to-day activities, usually in our FM kind of daily lives, and we talk a lot about managing costs and how are we going to meet client expectations. But one of the things that we need to look at is that big picture. Now, let's see, back in June, we talked about metrics and KPIs where we concentrated on what is that big picture, how do you get to the big picture, how do you link the daily activities of FM into the organizational mission, and how do we understand how to measure and prove our success, what is going to relate and align with what the organization is about. Today, we're going to kind of keep that same hat on and take a look at that big picture for the organization, but we're really going to focus on risk. It's something that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about in our daily lives in facility management, but something that we need to. And one of the things to think about is how do you manage risk? There's risks happening all of the time. There's lots of things we naturally are going to be dealing with on a daily basis. For example, how to keep people safe. That's something that is regularly built into our processes. But if you thought about kind of long-term, big picture, how do I keep people safe? We start thinking about events that are difficult to predict, and they may be natural disasters. They could be other occurrences that could impact our business. And if you thought about that, there are a few questions up here that we can ask as we think about that risk question, such as how do I plan for the future? How do I think about the impacts of potential events? How do I make sure that I'm getting what I'm paying for? If you thought about that long term and you thought about contracted services, for example, we'll spend a few minutes on that. How do I ensure that day-to-day expectations are met? Again, we're looking at the daily, but we're really taking that high-level cut and thinking about long term. How are we managing our business, and how are we ensuring that we have minimal impact? And then lastly, kind of the big one that a lot of people think about when they think about risk management, it's that last one of how can I be sure that we can keep going in the face of a big event? So something big happens, a fire, a tornado, an earthquake. What do I do? And am I prepared for that? This is our agenda for today. It's a 4-point agenda. So if you are a person who likes to know where are we in this slide deck, this will help clue you in a little bit. We're going to work our way through these 4 items. We'll start with looking at the risk management process and why do we need that. And then we'll take a look at different types of risks, identifying them. And then how do you create a plan? And then I'll take you through a couple of different examples in facility management. So first off, that need for a risk management process. In the past, as I'd mentioned, we've talked about kind of the high level of facilities, and we've talked about the cost center, facilities being thought of as a cost center versus a different way to think about it as, I'd prefer actually to think about it as an opportunity to invest in our organization's success. Our facilities are really contributing to that big picture, and it helps us. Our facility is sort of a very support network for those who are advancing our organization in the more direct activities. As facility managers, we have a responsibility to maintain the systems and the organization's assets. We are also responsible for the alignment of facility management goals and linking those up to the organizational goals. And then finally, we're responsible for the connection between facility management services and our overall organizational success. Now, our organization doesn't always understand that. It's incumbent upon us in facilities to help demonstrate how these things are linked together. So we're going to spend a few minutes just unpacking what these different things are. If you were to look at caring for your assets over the facility life cycle, you could think about it in terms of protecting, maintaining, and sustaining your facilities. Protecting, we're really looking at things like preventive maintenance and refreshing surfaces and repairing systems and making sure that we're keeping up with them. So sometimes those daily and planned activities are really helping us with that overall large picture of mitigating long-term risk. The reason we maintain systems is so that those systems are reliable and there for us as we need them and as reasonably as we can expect. Maintaining those systems, we're again keeping that facility going. And then that sustainment, if you think about sustainability, a lot of times we automatically think of environmental stewardship, environmental sustainability. And what I'm really talking about is that long-term sustainment of the facilities, keeping them going, thinking about it as more of a life cycle kind of concept. This all holds together to help us meet, again, that mission of the organization. Another element is the strategy, whereas we're thinking about the alignment of the facility management goals with our organizational goals. We're thinking about what must the organization be about, therefore what must we in facility management be about? How do we link those missions? The areas that we tend to be honing around are things like safety and security. How do we keep people safe? How do we keep our assets secure? How do we make sure that they're not compromised? In resilience, we're looking at the ability to return to normal. Should something happen, what is our ability to get back to normal business and support normal business operations? In emergency preparedness and business continuity, we want our buildings to be able to respond to conditions, our facilities and our systems to be able to respond to conditions, and then to maintain our core business functions. So think about something disruptive. How are we not only resilient, but how are we also prepared to maintain business operations so that we're not completely sideways in the face of different events? And then that sustainability or sustainment is that long-term viability of our facilities, of our systems, of our staff, of our personnel. And then lastly, we have the connection of FM services to our organizational success. And this is, again, thinking about that alignment, looking at what is our organization about, therefore what must we be about? We have in any facility, any organization, you have a lot of people that have their various agendas to accomplish that are tagging into this larger picture. In facilities, we are absolutely no different. There's a big picture that our organization needs to meet, and we are helping point that way forward in the very often support kinds of activities that we do. So the risk management process, again, is taking a look at that, protect, maintain, sustain, add to that our ability to align our goals, and then connect the organization to facility management. That is playing into our risk management process. So as we think about the risks, we're going to get to, we're getting to the specifics, and this is kind of where a lot of us are very at home. There's a number of different kinds of risks. We tend to think about things like fire. There's a picture of a tornado, loss of power, flooding. There's also the people side of the risk. The ones that there's some things that are more common than natural disasters. Those we tend to think about as more social preparation, and by code we're prepared. So we have things like fire extinguishers in place. We have sprinkler systems in place, hydrants. So we have a certain amount of preparation there. We're also used to drilling for fire systems. Tornadoes, you may drill in your buildings for tornado events if that's something that's relevant in your area. And to deal with these various things, we have systems in place. So you might have backup power, you might have battery power, you're going to have your firefighting systems. There's some of these things that are already just inherent to the building, and we expect that they're going to be there to respond when we need them. But there's something bigger. There's a much bigger picture that we're trying to put in context here. What we don't want to do is we manage our risk. We're also trying to figure out, aside from just the regular things that we expect to be handled in normal ways, how do we deal with things that we haven't thought of? How do we keep the bigger picture going? How do we have a planned response that gets us back to normal? Now, there's an interesting report. It's the Horizon report from the Business Continuity Institute. And they took a look at the top 10 threats in facilities. And this was an interesting one to take a look at. They identified top was cyber attacks, and then data breach, and then unplanned IT and telecom outages. What was interesting to me in looking at this is those first three are all IT related. The rest of them are things like number 5, adverse weather. We're fairly used to thinking about that, especially in this day and age. We've had a lot of practice at this recently. Depending on where you live in the country, you probably have an event that you've homed in on. There's also there's outside sources, things like acts of terrorism, et cetera, different people doing things. We also have other outsiders like supply chain disruption as well, things that we can't necessarily control, but we do have something we can do to mitigate those risks. So as we think about this, this is a really good list as you're building your risk management plan and your response to a risk management threat. This is a good list to help walk through and take a look at what kinds of things may be impacting you, what kinds of things might you need to think about, what do you already have in place, what could happen, and how might you respond. So as you're assessing your risk, a couple of things to do is number one, take a look. What is your risk? Depending on where you're located, you may have certain natural risks that are going to come up, things like threat of fire, threat of earthquake, threat of tornado. What are your threats? You might have safety and security as a much more common one that we're dealing with today. So we tend to start thinking about access control. Those are our first responses, things like fire sprinklers, access control, and whatnot. Those help us deal with the event itself. But we're also thinking bigger picture, long term. What's going to happen. Think about your city. Is there in the location that you're in, is there something that is unique and special to your city that may be outside of your building's control, but is something having to do with the regional area that you're in, or perhaps maybe in your state, if you thought about your state and the weather. This was one we looked at last year when we had World Workplace in Houston. We had challenges that we were facing, and what was interesting is to take a look at this tornado map in conjunction with events that had recently been experienced. And this, again, depending on where you're located in the country, this may be a bigger or lesser threat. This is information available from NOAA, and NOAA that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They've got climate data. So if you're taking a look at natural disaster kinds of threats, NOAA is a very good resource as we're thinking about what kinds of things might happen, what is the likelihood that it may happen, is this really a significant threat? If you were in Nevada, for example, chances are a tornado is not going to be really high on your list. Experientially, you might know this. Looking at the data, you could absolutely back that up. If you're in Texas, for example, though, you might take a look at the data, and it's much more reinforced that the likelihood of an event is much higher than someone in, say, Nevada. So these are some data resources that we can take a look at as we consider what might happen. In a risk assessment, this helps you. We're looking at things like what happens if we were to lose our facility for whatever reason, whether it be a natural disaster or a power outage. Perhaps the weather is really, really hot and we lose power. We have rolling blackouts. That's been experienced in various states across the U.S. What happens if we lose personnel? And it could be loss of personnel through tragedy. It could be loss of personnel through contract. What would you do if those people were to leave? Loss of telecommunications. This gets back to our IT. What happens if you lose your data? What happens if you lose your ability to communicate in ways that we're normally used to? And then loss of utilities. Utilities are those things that we typically expect to be there. We expect when we turn the tap on, the water's going to run. We expect that when we flip the light switch, the lights are going to be there. There's a lot of things that we've come to expect. But what happens if these things go away? So as we're looking at the risk assessment, these are some big, broad categories of types of things that could happen independent of a specific weather or a particular event. So as you're thinking about the risk assessment, what we're looking at is what is the thing that could happen, and then what is the likelihood that it may happen in your area. Again, with tornadoes, you could use that as an example. If you're in Nevada, low likelihood, probably not high on the list. But something like a fire in Nevada, probably a little bit more likely. If you're in California, definitely very likely. Wildfires are big right now. And then we're looking at the severity of the event. And the severity is not a severity of the event itself, but the severity and its impact to your business. So if something like, if you were to look at the likelihood of a tornado and then what could it do to your business, that starts to give you a risk rating. I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And the purpose of a risk rating and understanding the likelihood of an event and then its potential impact on your business is to help give you a prioritized list that shows you what your highest risks are in a really simplified format. Kind of certain things are going to float to the top, sometimes things that are not necessarily on the radar. We're going to move on to creating a plan. As you think about your risk management plan, there's 4 steps here that I've outlined. They're pretty simple, pretty basic. If you're just getting started on a risk management plan, these are kind of 4 key things to think about. Number 1, identify your risks. We talked about that a few slides ago. Understand what kinds of things could happen. Are they weather events? What kinds of weather events might you expect? People events, what kinds of things could occur? Do you have secured facilities? What happens if someone comes in and has access to certain information? Or can someone come in and have access to certain people? How might you respond? And then evaluate your potential. Your potential is all about what is your exposure? What is your exposure to that potential risk? And then we're looking at what is our acceptable level of exposure. That is the game of risk. There are things that are going to happen all of the time, and what we're looking to do is to mitigate as much as we can those things that we know how to minimize. And then we determine what our response is going to be. So in the world where many, many things can happen, there are a set number of things that you can really respond to, and there's a certain amount that you can reasonably budget for, plan for, and determine your response. So these are kind of our basic 4 steps. Now, in developing a risk management process, these are some different examples from different groups. That first one, the diamonds, we've got the risk probability, looking at the likelihood that each thing will occur, and then the impact. What is your potential effect on operations? Over to the right of that, we have a probability versus impact rating. This is another way to score the likelihood that an event is going to occur and what will its impact be on our business. And you can see if we have something that is very low likelihood and it doesn't really do that much, then we are very low on the scale. A lot of times what we're looking for is what's the high likelihood things and or what are the high impact things, and how do we manage or mitigate that risk. On the lower left, there's a different way to look at, kind of a different take on the same thing as we're looking at probability and looking to lower our risk. And then we have, rather than saying very high to very low, we have negligible to severe. Again, just different terms. These get adopted for different facilities and different groups, depending on what language speaks best to that organization. And then on the lower right, we have, again, that sort of that risk diagram where we look at impact versus probability of occurrence. If you were to graph, if you were to take a number of different risks, risk opportunities, and graph them on a diagram, you could compare them on a risk like the one on the lower right. And then we typically start looking at what are the things that are super high critical and pay attention to those first in terms of what demands our immediate attention, our response, perhaps our budgeting, and certainly our response planning time. The risk register is an example. It kind of takes those prior tools that you just saw, and it categorizes them. Now, this is an eye chart. You are not meant to go ahead and read this, so you might be very up close to your screen right now trying to look at this. I'll walk through an example in just a moment. The risk register has a number of things on it. This is a really good tool as we talk about identifying your risks. This is really a good programmatic way of doing that. You can take a look at your risk category and then look at what is the thing that could happen. So you might have something like a business resilience sort of issue. What happens if your HVAC or your cooling fails? Well, if it's a data center, it's probably going to be a fairly big deal. What's the risk and what is the impact of that thing happening? If your data center goes down, does it send your business sideways? And what is the impact overall? And so we're taking a look at what's the probability of that occurrence and what is the potential impact. And these are things that as the facility manager, you know. And then we rank those risks in terms of which things are really going to command our biggest attention, which things are lower in our overall priority list. So again, this is a really good tool that you can use. We're going to take a look at examples. We're going to back into a few different examples of how this really works. So the first one is looking at a facility service contract, which this doesn't always ring a bell with people immediately. A lot of times what we think about is the natural disasters, a news event, something that we hear about on the news. Could this happen in my facilities? But facility service contracts are actually, that is something that's incredibly important in terms of its potential impact should something go sideways. So we're going to talk through a couple of things on this. Contracts are controllable to a degree. There's something we can respond to, certainly through facility management. And one thing we want to do up front is make sure that we understand our risks as we enter contracted services. There's a few different risks. There's a paper that was developed. It's the analysis of risks associated with facility management outsourcing from the Journal of Facility Management. The reference is actually at the bottom of the screen should you want to go and look at that. And what they looked at were what were the top few risks in contracted services. And you can see here there's things like an inexperienced client. What happens if you're the client, you're the owner of the building, and you've never had contracted services? There's some risk there because you're not necessarily aware of what you might be running into and what you need to be aware of. So just that the very nature that you are a little bit newer on contracted services opens you up to a certain element of risk because you're discovering things along the way and hopefully looking for good advice as you go. Another element on the service provider side is financial soundness. Financial soundness looks at more what is the risk that business is going to be around long term? What happens if their business failed? Would you, as the owner or the facility manager, what would your response to that be if your contracted service provider suddenly went bankrupt or they had to leave? How would that leave you? What happens if you have poor quality of service? Poor quality of service is probably a very well-known and well-experienced one, which we'll talk about in just a minute, why that happens, but that can be very impactful because it impacts the services not only that we deliver, but its expectations of the people that we serve. And it certainly impacts the daily complaints that we might receive and how we're able to go forward and do our jobs. On the contract side, you might see something like an absence of benchmarks. Now, we talked a few months ago about metrics and KPIs, and one of the reasons we have metrics and KPIs is to help us understand when things are working well and where they need some attention and correction. From a contracts perspective, we want to make sure that we have the right metrics in place so we understand that we're getting what we should be getting, and when things are outside those lines, what should we be doing about that? A lot of times from a contract perspective, we'll try to tie outcomes to finance and to financial incentives or penalties to ensure that the essentials of the contract are being met. Inadequate definition of scope. Another fun one, being unclear between ourselves about owner expectations versus service provider expectations. We want to make sure that everybody is crystal clear about what is to be expected. If we are unclear, if we're fuzzy, and we get if we get a poor quality deliverable on the client side and the facility management side, we might be back up to that poor quality of service line item, and that may have its essence rooted in the inadequate definition of the scope set up in the first place. And so these things tend to be related, and they kind of build on one another. Poor relationship between the owner and service provider is another classic. I have seen this one. I actually saw in a facility a relationship between, it had been very, very strong between an owner and a service provider. Everything had been wonderful for a number of years. And a new person on the owner's team came in, and things were suddenly not very good. And because that relationship went downhill, it impacted the team entirely and their ability to really do their work well. And so what we started seeing were benchmarks of performance. It looked like they were going downhill. People were leaving, so they were losing their continuity of ability to carry out that business. That was rooted in a bad relationship. Those are key things to look at in contracted services. And then security is another one. Security can look like access to information. If you have someone coming in as a contract service provider, they're exposed to a lot of information and data. They also may have access to various areas of the facility. And so understanding how we're going to keep that risk as reasonably low as possible is a key thing that we want to walk through as we're negotiating contracts and thinking about how those services are executed. Now, there's a number of things that you can do with risk response. This is a really, really simple diagram, but I love this. I love it actually for its simplicity. The best thing that you can do entirely as you think about your risk response option is avoid the risk altogether if you can. The worst thing you can do is accept the risk. It tends to be, we don't necessarily retain our business value in that. And when you think about accepting risk, that seems like a vague term or a vague concept. Accepting risk essentially is rolling over, not thinking about mitigation measures. What might you do if you could, but just saying, oh, well, things can happen. I have new people in my building. I'm not going to worry about it. We'll just accept that people are going to be coming in and out, and the service provider is going to manage it. So as an FM, you almost are divorcing yourself in that example of any potential consequence and ability to respond. And that's really not a good practice. There's a couple of choices in the middle. A lot of times we can't always avoid risk entirely in contracted services. One way to avoid the risks introduced by contracted services is not having contracted services. But that's not always a possibility. It might not be a reasonable choice. There may be a very good reason, there often is, for having contracted services in place. But there are things that you can do to reduce or mitigate your risk. One is in the very setup of the contract, ensuring that you have an appropriate scope, ensuring that you understand what the benchmarks are going to be, understand your QA process, and how you validate that the letter of the contract has been met. Another response that you can have is transferring the risk. In other words, if something doesn't happen, you're pushing that risk off. If you're the FM and you're transferring your risk, you're giving consequence to someone else. Now, the bad thing about it sounds like a really good thing, and you may be thinking, oh, I'll just give that to so and so. I'll make the service provider pay for that thing. The problem with doing that is you start to, as the FM, you start to lose control and buy-in of what's happening. You also start to lose the relationship that hopefully you have worked to build with your contract service provider. That just does not put you in a good future position for negotiation and certainly for conflict resolution, which inevitably things happen. So if the best thing you can do is avoid the risk altogether, but then if you can't, look at ways that you can reduce that risk. This will get a little bit more clear. So we're going to talk about evaluating your potential and look at that risk register. And I've got an example pulled out here. We're actually going to take a look at the vendor-driven issue of financial failure. And if you take a look at that is, it's this risk number 2 up here. I think there's a little circle that's going to pop up. What happens if there's insufficient capital to fund ongoing services? This is one that the FM team walked through and said, okay, what happens if they fail? What happens if they don't have enough money? Well, what's the nature of the risk? All right, we'll walk through that. It's inability of the service provider to fund payroll, supplies, other operating taxes, and expenses. Okay, so then what happens? Probability of occurrence on a scale of 1 to 5, they rate it as a 2. So they don't think it's likely to happen, but it could happen. The impact on the event on a scale of 1 to 5, very impactful. Why? If their service provider, in this particular example, their service provider has quite a lot of control and does quite a lot for them, the loss of that service provider would be incredibly problematic for them. And so if you were then to look at the risk index or the risk calculation, the risk would then be translated as a 10. It's that 2 times 5 is 10. So it doesn't end there, though. If you thought about it, what could you do to reduce your risk? If all you were doing was accepting the risk, then you basically just look at this risk register, you review it, and you say, right, okay, they need to not fail, and on you go. But there is something that you can do about it. What might you do? So we have another part of that risk register, and as we're walking through it, and we think about what could we do to minimize the impact of financial failure. Well, this is not something as the FM hiring the contracted service provider. You don't have control over their finances and how they manage those. But you can take a look at how their business acts. So if you were to look at their financial stability ahead of time, and then take a look at their commitments, at the resources that they're going to apply, you could start to take a look at and get more comfortable with the probability that occurrence may happen. So if it did happen, you've rated it as a 2, but perhaps through a pre-assessment of that vendor, you figured out that they actually are pretty stable, which then changes your probability down to, this group has actually rated it down to a 1, and it gives them a new risk index of a 5. So again, this is just a really short example that takes a look at a process of identifying the risks, the potentials, and the impacts, and then looking at, is there something you could do to help avoid that risk or bring it down so that it's not quite a 10. So we've brought it down in this case on a color chart. We've brought it down to that medium color of yellow down to a green. So I'll talk about a couple of other things. In contracted services, a lack of understanding of the contract scope. Again, this is more common than I think we would all like it to be, but we basically are seeing things a little bit differently between the facility manager / owner and the one providing the service. We have a different idea of what it is we are to provide, and that introduces an element of risk in that. From an owner, operator, facility manager side of things, I'm not necessarily getting the level of service that I'm wanting. And that's going to have impacts. It could mean that I get more complaints from people in the buildings, and that takes more of my time. It could mean that I'm just frustrated all of the time, and that's not healthy. It could mean that my equipment, if it's not being tended to the level of detail and specificity that I believe it should be, it could mean that I could have premature failures, or at least I might think there may be that. And this is an argument for understanding ahead of time, what is it you have, how are you expecting it to be cared for, And let's be on the same page between our contracted service providers about what those expectations are so that everybody understands what the outcome should look like. Another one is the wrong measures being used to judge contract performance. This is an interesting one too. I've seen this one more times than I'd care to admit. One of the example that stands out for me is a story of a facility. It was a wonderful facility. It was huge. And it was a facility that everyone in facilities wanted to be working at. It was a premier place for people to work. And what was really interesting is they had many, many metrics to measure performance of provided services in this facility. And if you were to look at the performance, their balanced scorecard for how they were measuring performance, you would see that everything was green. There was nothing that was red. You may see the occasional yellow, but everything looked like it was being done very, very well. They had tons and tons of data to prove how well this building was being cared for. The problem was people were leaving in higher amounts than were normal, and certainly in higher amounts than had been expected and experienced at this facility, and it was causing a lot of disruption in service to that particular location. There was a reason for it, and there was a response to it. But what stood out to me in that particular case was how in the world could you have so many metrics and everything looks wonderful, and between all of those metrics, you still can't see that there's a problem. As we think about metrics and measures, one of the points that we made a couple of webinars ago was sometimes more data is just more data. Having the right information that helps you hone in and understand what's being done well and what isn't going well will help you more quickly identify and mitigate problems before they become much bigger issues that have the ability to undo your services. For service contract providers, this is a huge deal. We want to make sure that as a service contract provider, that we're meeting the needs of our clients, but we're also bound to perform within the confines of a contract. So we're trying to make sure that we're on the same page. But having those appropriate measures in place and agreeing to them is really key to that success. Another risk is the shortfall in quality control, and what this tends to look like is it's sort of an outflowing of the contract, what we're supposed to be doing, and then how we're measuring our success. But if we don't have a good, robust quality control approach and an ability to understand what it is we should be getting, and then make sure that we're actually getting that, we could have some problems. So an example might be ensuring that preventive maintenance tasks are being performed completely. That all of the PMs that are logged to be done, are they really happening? Are they being done adequately and correctly? From a manager and facility management position, you want to make sure periodically that you're checking on those things, and that we have that mutual agreement to ensure that the services provided are really being provided well and correctly. It's in everybody's best interest to do so. And again, what we're doing is managing our risk. In having a good quality control approach, we're looking to make sure that our systems are maintained well, that they're maintained adequately, that we minimize the risk of failure because we've been maintaining. Preventive maintenance is all about ensuring that the systems operate as they're supposed to, and to the best of our ability by caring for them appropriately. We want the system to be there to do its job. So if we have something like an air conditioning system or a power system, it's fundamentally there to provide power or to deliver air conditioning. If we maintain it properly, hopefully it can do that for a good long time and exceed its useful life. So there's a few other risks with the contracted services. Some of these we've gone through. There's a couple on here that are in addition. Mismatch between services delivered and customer expectations. That's another classic. Again, typically handled through a contract. Failure to recognize and promptly address contract performance problems. So these are risks in contracted services. I'm actually going to move on to our last example. And this ties more to emergency preparedness and business resilience. One of the things that we think a lot about, again, when we think about emergency preparedness and resilience, is kind of those big events. And those of us who are in those who are in that emergency preparedness, especially if you've ever been through an event, this will really be top of mind. There are a lot of benefits from planning. You can reduce your impacts. You can minimize health and safety risks. Really, one of the key things is minimizing business interruptions and the impacts of those various disruptions. You're also minimizing the risk to your corporation. One thing that can happen in big events, if the business is highly disrupted, some businesses just don't recover. And that's, from a risk management perspective, on the facility management side, that's something we very much need to be paying attention to, ensuring that our facilities actually are resilient, that we do have the ability to the best possible ability we can, that we can recover. Now, if we, on the risk of not planning side, if we haven't really thought much about this, we could be introducing additional risks like unsafe conditions for people. We can't recover in our facility. We can't recover quickly. Perhaps we can deal with the immediate event, but long term, so we might be able to get people out of the building in a fire threat or another natural disaster threat, but long term, our facility and our organization might not be robust in the way that is really needed. We had an example, and this particular example is really literally close to home for me. We had, if you remember, well, actually, you probably remember if you've been watching the news at all, California has had a lot of issues with fires lately, the last year, really. So about 11 months ago, there was a huge fire that broke out in Sonoma County, and it rocked the community. It ripped through the area. And people came from all around the world to help fight these fires. The facility that I'm in was closed for 2 weeks. It was inaccessible, closed off by the National Guard. So there's a good. So it's not just that we wanted to keep it closed; it was that you just could not get to that facility, and employees were displaced. So those are the impacts that we immediately saw: inability to get there. And there are a lot of other impacts, but from a business perspective, it was a closed building and people that can't go back to the building the way that they were used to. So the positives from this is actually a good story in the middle of a tragedy. The positives that came out of that was my team had made a business continuity plan and had talked through what could happen in the event of a disaster, or for some reason the building was inaccessible. Now, one of the good things I will tell you on a footnote with this was we could not have foreseen the massive fire. That was just not on our radar. And I suspect for a lot of people that would not be on their radar. But what we did talk about is, what if you couldn't get into the building? What would you do? And there's many reasons you might not be able to get to a building. It could be an earthquake, it could be a tornado, it could be a fire, it could be a hostage event. Many, many things can lead to your inability to get to your building. But what do you do if you can't get in? And so through that business continuity plan, we had talked about it and practiced it, and established as a result of that, remote work locations. The critical data and information was backed up. Temporary housing for employees was provided, and bottom line, business continued. It was inconvenient, definitely, but the positive thing was we were able to move forward in spite of the craziness of that particular event. So that is probably the closest to home example that I've ever experienced where I could see business continuity, planning, and risk management in action. It's, again, that ability to take a look at what could happen, what will you do, what's your plan for maintaining continuity of business. So again, not just getting people out of the building and keeping them safe, that is your first call, but from a bigger perspective in managing risk, what do you do after that? How do you keep the business going? How do you manage that risk and put steps in place so that business can continue? So as you think about, as we wrap up, and we're a bit early today, as you think about the value of evaluating and managing your risk, Think about it in these terms. The job of the facility manager is to enable your customer to continue its mission. So it may be, you may be the facility manager, and this is your company. You could be a service provider, actually, and this is your employer. But we're looking at helping that organization continue to do what it needs to do, and we're managing that risk. To that end, we're thinking about how to protect, maintain, and sustain operations so that our organizations can continue. So with proper planning, you can minimize your impacts of a disruption, any kind of disruption. You can improve your overall performance and then also minimize your corporate risk or your organization's risk. And with that wraps up our webinar today.
Excellent, very informative, Lori. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, you can type it into your question box on the control panel now. We'll give you just a moment to do that. And also, as a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be posted on the CFC website. And if you've ever missed any of the webinars or you want to go back and look through, it's a great resource if at the time something didn't strike you as something necessary, but now you need that topic. I would really encourage you to go to, I believe it's cfcifma.org. Go there and look through their archive of webinars. And if you do have any questions about this webinar that come up to you after the fact, Lori Gilmer, her email is on the screen right now, lori.gilmer@FEAPC. And we'll give you just another moment before we wrap it up. Is there anything you wanted to add, Lori?
Oh, I'm thinking, that the thing that always occurs to me as I wrap up these things is it's sort of the stories of things that happen in facilities and the things that we hear people comment after presentations like this. A lot of times we'll hear about people have their own personal stories of what's happened, and sometimes what happens to us in facilities is we're busy with the day-to-day, and we don't necessarily think about long-term impacts. We know that we need to, and what really makes us think about it is if we have an event of our own, whether it's a fire or you had an intruder come in. It drives us to think about those particular events and plan accordingly. If an event has not happened to you, this is a good opportunity to take a pause, take a step back, and reevaluate how you think about threats and exposure and business continuity. If you've not thought about this ever before, a really easy place to start is to take a look at a few buckets of information, or buckets of sort of how you categorize ideas, like what would cause you to keep people in a facility and have to shelter in place? What would cause you to make people leave a facility or not be able to come into the facility? And how would you handle those two conditions? There's kind of a short term and there's a long-term response. So in the short term, you're concerned with keeping people safe, and that may be why you have people in the building or you push them out of the building. And then long term, what do you do to make sure that your business can continue? Is there I was at a facility recently. It was really interesting. It was a government facility, and we were taking a look at some equipment. And I happened to be in this one room, and I asked about the particular piece of equipment. It was an HVAC system, 100% outside air, not running. And the gentleman I was with could not recall. He actually didn't know the piece of equipment was there, and he could not recall having ever seen it on a maintenance list, and it didn't exist in their inventory, which was keenly interesting to me. In looking at this and looking at the group that it served, what we surmised was it was a critical piece of equipment meant to provide dedicated space conditioning in the event of a disaster that would allow this particular group to be on its own. They wouldn't have to be on a building system. And the risk that popped out to me at that moment was, I thought, my goodness, this piece of equipment, I don't know how they're maintaining it. What I couldn't tell you is whether or not it was on any kind of maintenance plan. What I could tell you is they didn't seem to know about it, which would suggest nobody's maintaining it. Now, for a critical piece of equipment that's meant to be there in times of distress, that's something that should throw up a red flag right there. And so taking some of those moments, so that was taken to the facility manager who identified that as a potential issue. But it's little things like that we have insights into every day. Little things like that pop up, where we sometimes put systems in place, but in that case we forgot about it, and didn't realize that we needed to maintain it. Now think about that. If for some reason, let's say it's a big HVAC system that's meant to be there as a backup for a potential disaster, and let's say we had old filters or a fan belt that had snapped, and you throw that system into service and it can't do its job. Well, then you've got a very expensive system that is not backing you up the way that your plan would suggest it should. So as we think about risks and we think about mitigation measures, those are the kinds of things that we're walking through too, ensuring that our preventive maintenance plans are complete, that they're practiced, that we audit them, that we understand what critical equipment we have. If we've got a critical plan that's supposed to be enacted, is our equipment there to support it? Those are really important measures to walk through, and you can kind of start at that high cut level of what would cause people to exit the building. Is there anybody who stays? If there's a critical area that has to maintain, it has to be up all of the time. What are the dependent systems that play into that? Do we have an emergency generator? Can they get lights? Can they get regular power? Do they have space conditioning? Is there equipment power? And walking through those and then backing into, some facilities have dual power. They have two different power sources just in case they lose main power off of one transformer. Or if they have a transformer go, they at least have a secondary option. But there's lots of different ways. And some people have much more sophisticated systems than others. One of the key things to start out with is understanding just what do you have, are you maintaining it, and can you prove it?
Excellent. I do need to correct one thing. I gave the wrong web address. It's actually ismacfc.org. So I encourage you to check out the website. And I want to do a shout out and a pitch for the CFC meeting at World Workplace. It will be Wednesday morning, the day that World Workplace starts. It's free to attend. So if you're in the Charlotte area or you're attending World Workplace, I would encourage you to come attend the CFC meeting. Again, it's free of charge, starts at 8 a.m., and there will be a breakfast provided. Lori, I've gotten some feedback that they really enjoyed the presentation. So I want to thank you for your time and for another great presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.